There are a lot of content creators on YouTube who give all sorts of advice about language learning, mostly from personal experience. Don't listen to them, or at least take what they say with a healthy dose of skepticism. It's not that I have anything against them, well, most of them, and in fact, I watch way too much of their content because I enjoy it. But there's a problem. Almost all of them have grand theories of language learning that come from some combination of their own personal experience and common sense. The problem is that the empirical scientific evidence doesn't always conform to what feels truthy to them, and what works for one individual may come down to other factors about their personal, mental, and psychological makeup, goals, first language, and language of study. And worse, sometimes they have succeeded not because of their approaches to language learning, but in spite of them. If you've decided that this year you're getting serious about learning a language, then you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to give you the tools you need to succeed. We're going to discuss goals. We're going to discuss the difference between strategy and tactics and how to choose the right strategies and tactics to meet your goals. We're going to talk about how you actually beat new words and grammatical structures into your brain. And we're going to talk about neurodivergence and neurospiciness. What I'm not going to do is tell you that you, viewer, should sit for this amount of time on this day of the week with this specific resource because it worked for me. I'm going to give you the tools to determine what will work best to achieve what you want out of language learning in 2025. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I have a PhD in linguistics, the science of language, from the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm an avid language lover and language learner, which is not always guaranteed with linguists. And together, we're going to get 2025 started right. This is Language Jones. This week's video is sponsored by Lingoda. Lingoda is not an app, it's a language school, and I am blown away by their quality, especially their course organization and their glossy learning materials. They offer small group and sometimes individual classes in English, French, Spanish, German, and Italian. You'll get started speaking from day one, and they can get you up to B2 or even C1 in some languages. I'm currently in the middle of a sprint in French, and it's awesome. And that's actually their current promotion. They have teachers from around the world, and you can schedule lessons to fit your schedule as flexibly as you want. But if you're motivated by a challenge, you want to make language learning a daily habit, and you're looking to make blazing fast progress, their sprint is great. It's a challenge you pose to yourself. The sprint challenge is 30 lessons in 60 days, and if you complete it, you get either 50% cash back or another 30 lessons. The super sprint is 60 lessons in 60 days for either 50% cash back or another 60 lessons. I'm in the middle of a sprint right now, and the consistency combined with the quality of their materials is really rapidly improving my French. They've got course materials on all sorts of topics, everything from literature to ordering a coffee, to getting a haircut, to ghosts, to grammatical lessons that really get you a robust vocabulary around expressing cause and effect. I didn't know how bad I needed that. So if you want to get your New Year's resolution started right, with external accountability and classes that are so fun and informative that you actually look forward to them, built around your schedule, definitely check out Lingoda. Use my link in description or personalized promo code for 20 euros off. Lastly, for what it's worth, I occasionally see students in Lingoda classes who joined on my recommendation, and not only are they enjoying it, but they speak really well. So if this sounds right for you, use my link in description, and happy learning. Some of you might be like, hey, wait a minute. Didn't you have a How to Learn a Language in 2024 video? Is this just an engagement driver based on seasonal viewing cycles on YouTube? And to you, I'd say first, thank you for watching my video about the linguistics of social media manipulation. I'll link it at the end for those of you who haven't seen it. But second, I've actually learned a lot in the last year about what works and refined my thinking. I've also learned some new things about psychology, motivation, and even learning approaches for neurodivergent folks. So some of this will overlap with what I've already said, and some will be new. So let's dive in. You want to learn a language. Great. What does that mean? Well, in the literature and linguistics, that's actually a contentious topic, because of course it is. So the first step is to think about what you actually want to do. It's totally fine if this changes over time. In fact, you should expect that as you learn more and develop different skills. But no French is not a reasonable goal. It's an impossible goal. No native French speaker knows all of French, so don't put that on yourself. It will never end. Instead, what we can actually say about native speakers, which I say with a huge quotation mark because that's contested too, because of course it is that they have a deep intuitive knowledge of the grammatical structures of their language. They have a relatively large and varied vocabulary, and they have the communicative competence across a range of life situations to navigate them effectively. But nobody has them all. So I have a French family member who's a sommelier. He has an extensive and robust vocabulary about wine. He brings his own wine places, and on more than one occasion has swapped out whatever my Aunt Lydie put out on the table with a wine with a more refined nose or whatever. There have been fights. He once threw a Côte du Rhône he found wanting off a balcony. Here's the thing. When he talks about wine to the rest of my French-speaking family, to varying degrees, they have no idea what he's saying. They're all speaking French, but he's speaking sommelier French. Now, maybe doing a sommelier bicycle tour across France is your ideal end application of your language learning. That's a real thing you can do, by the way. Maybe it's not the end goal for you. And if not, learning all that vocabulary may never be relevant to you, which makes it, aside from some marginal benefits from just exposure to French more broadly, a colossal waste of your time. So the first thing to do is decide what you want to do. Set a short-term goal, and then develop the appropriate strategies and tactics to work toward that goal. If your goal is to read Camus in the original, then getting started with specific skills for reading will get you there pretty quickly. But those same skills are totally irrelevant to navigating getting from the train station to checking into your hotel, to going to a museum and having an apéro after. Not nary a one of those people is going to use the passé simple when you talk to them, or the pluperfect subjunctive, the use of which is literally a plot point in La Chute. Here's what I think is non-negotiable. You should have a general understanding of the grammar of the language. This does not mean you have memorized everything and can explain everything, just that you know all the different kinds of things your target language does or cares about. So for instance, Mandarin doesn't have tense at all, but really cares about aspect. I've got videos on this if these words are gibberish to you. Russian really cares about aspect, but has tenses. Persian and Hebrew really care about marking definiteness and care a little bit about case marking, especially when something is definite. Mandarin basically doesn't mark case at all. Russian has 6. Hungarian has, depending on how you count, 64 cases. Persian doesn't have gender. English has gender only on third-person pronouns, and that's on its way out. German has 3 genders. Zulu has 17. This does not mean that you have to be super knowledgeable about linguistic typology, although some of my subscribers right now are probably thinking, don't threaten me with a good time. But how do subordinate clauses work in your language? How does quotation work? Hypotheticals. These vary across languages, but only in a small handful of predictable ways. You'll also need a decent vocabulary. The grammar is the structure everything hangs off of. The words are the things those structures are actually for. I think of this like a designer's mannequin or one of those cool mobiles by Alexander Calder. It's actually more of an apt metaphor than you might think if we're being super technical about linguistics. How do you decide which structures and vocabulary? Well, what are your goals? Literally, anything is fine. If it's interviewing people about what it's like to live in a remote French village, awesome. One set of skills. If it's watching Lupin, that's another, with lots of overlap. Next, you'll need to think about strategies and tactics. This is where people go wrong. These are how you actually move toward your goal. The big problem that most influencers and most apps have is that they mistake tactics for strategies. Tactics are the specific implementation, the thing you do, the words you memorize. But if you jump to tactics without a strategy, you could just be grinding your gears. The simplest form of strategic planning is to first determine your goal or goals, and then determine what would need to happen to meet your goals. Want to read Bolaño in the original? You'll need to have strategies for parsing long written sentences with subordinate clauses and stuff. You can scaffold vocabulary learning by using the books you're interested in to actually have your first exposure to a lot of vocabulary. This is the benefit of extensive reading and engagement with actual content, which lots of other YouTubers have extolled the virtues of. And for learning those grammatical structures, we've already started to identify which kinds of structures you might want to learn about. You can do so with a Google search or buying an actual grammar of Spanish or whatever your language is. So we've gone from goals to strategies to tactics in a broad sense, but notice that these tactics, while effective for learning Spanish, are terrible advice if you want to travel to Argentina and find the best cortado. Look up new words on first encounter is a great way to fail at every conversation and leave behind you a wake of annoyed Spanish speakers. So if it's having conversations that most speaks to you at the moment, you're going to want to have basic conversational frames, sentence structures, and vocabulary, and you want to recognize spoken language and be able to generate your own speech quickly. Not only that, but you'd better have some ways of stalling and asking for clarification. Totally different skill set, which requires totally different strategies and tactics to implement. But Jonesy boy, I can hear you saying, what if I wanted to do both? Fine. I just recommend picking specific short-term goals and working toward them on your way to achieving all of them. You can do them in parallel, that's fine. But adding structure will ensure that you see things frequently enough to, memorize them. Which brings me to memorization. I've talked about this before on my channel, but memorization is just not taught. And it's the core of language learning. So when you go to learn a language, your teachers, resources, apps, and so on just say, now memorize these words. But they don't tell you how. To be fair, a minority of them, like Michel Thomas, Rosetta Stone, and even Duolingo, say the opposite. Don't try to memorize these. We'll make sure it happens naturally. These approaches both suck. There's a huge literature on the science of memory, but you really only need to know two things. First, you generally cannot memorize something, or a lot of some things, in one sitting on one day. Remembering is at its core a process of repeated forgetting, and then either reminding yourself or being reminded. So don't beat yourself up for forgetting something. That's literally the process of learning. And if you want a vocabulary of 20,000 or 40,000 new words, guess what? You're going to be doing a lot of forgetting. As an aside, it's easier in your first language, so if you were that precocious kid with a large vocabulary of words like precocious because you just said it to yourself a bunch and tried to work it into sentences for a week or so, that shit's not going to work in your L2. And it's not about you being bad at learning languages. The second thing is that you can supercharge your learning by using smart strategies that tap into how our brains actually work. The more time you spend actually thinking about a new word or structure, relating the sounds to things you know, relating the structures to things you know, swapping words in and out of sentence frames, making associations, the easier it is to memorize. This is smart encoding. You can add to it by activating your amygdala and various other brain areas that fire before conscious thought by making associations with sex, violence, high emotion, and just general arousal in the physiological sense. I hate mnemonics, but in part it's because I hate that as corny as they are, they work. And what I often call naughty mnemonics work even better. This is why Gabriel Weiner recommends memorizing noun genders by visualizing the nouns bursting into flames for one gender or freezing to death for another. It's gruesome, but it works. But Doc, can't you just learn like a child? They don't study grammar. They don't memorize anything. Can't I sign up for that? Well, no. Not only are they surrounded by high-quality language input and caretakers who attend to their every need, but also their brains are just wired differently. It's not clear exactly when it stops or exactly what the boundaries around what can be acquired and what has to be learned are, but it's very clear that adults simply do not acquire language the way that children do. Children are famously impervious to correction, and they'll eventually just produce grammatically correct sentences with vocabulary they seemingly soaked up out of nowhere. That is, up to about the kindergarten level, which is not a level any self-respecting adult wants to speak at. Conversely, there are grammatical structures and nuances that adults can learn with a single explanation, but will not intuit with unlimited exposure in a naturalistic setting. But that's not to say that the core of what a lot of these influencers are picking up on is a completely wrong idea. A massive amount of exposure to the language you're learning is way better than just not that. So even if you don't understand everything, reading extensively, listening to podcasts and so on is very helpful. And there's a certain amount of unconscious processing that undoubtedly does happen, especially in like the phonological domain. It's just not sufficient on its own as a language learning strategy. Another thing that's tremendously helpful is spaced repetition. You can do this with software, I use Anki, or with flashcards in a notebook to keep track of your reviews. But when done right, it works. Leave me a comment if you want a full video on how to do it right, to the best of my knowledge and the state of the science. Another thing just to be aware of is that there are learning asymmetries. What I mean is that it's easier to recognize something than to produce it. It's easier to recognize written language with no processing time constraints than careful speech. It's easier to recognize careful speech than casual speech. And on the production side, the same is true. It's easier to write with unlimited time to check spelling and grammar and arrange your thoughts and so on than to have to speak on the fly. So not being able to generate the right word or sentence in conversation, especially under stress, doesn't mean that you don't know that word or structure. You may be able to recognize it and understand it, but need more time with it before you can generate it in real time. And similarly, recognizing something but not knowing what it means indicates that you've started the forgetting process that is, well, how we ultimately remember something. I mentioned not being able to produce something under stress. That's actually a really important point. Our bodies actually play a role. Unlike Kung Fu, it is not all in your mind. Physiological stress makes everything harder. It makes it harder to encode, it makes it harder to retrieve. And one way we end up under physiological stress that people ignore is a lack of sleep. I have a whole video about what happens in your brain while you're sleeping, but the key takeaway is that the consolidation of learned material, and even things that you were exposed to but not explicitly taught, happens during sleep. A little nap after a study session is associated with measurable improvements in comprehension and recall. And a good night's sleep consistently is going to help tremendously. I know this sounds absolutely unhinged, but good sleep, exercise, and healthy food actually make a measurable impact on not just your gains in the gym, but your gains in the brains. Similarly, if you're trying to learn a language in an environment that is noisy or distracting beyond a pleasant background level, it's going to impede progress. I once had a French teacher who was meaner than a junkyard dog, and I can tell you from personal experience that negative emotional valence also affects your learning. But of course, there are tons of studies backing this up too. This is why I always caution people against studying that language they feel like they should already know. Feelings of obligation and shame are not great long-term motivators for tedium and repetition, and it ends up being a self-perpetuating cycle. I also don't recommend studying a language you have strong negative feelings about because of life experience. I literally had someone asking me how to motivate themselves to study, we'll call it language X. And I asked why they weren't excited to study language X, and they were like, speakers of language X killed members of my family. And you want to engage with it why? To disabuse myself of negative stereotypes. That's not language learning motivation. The ultimate desire is not really to rehabilitate others in your mind, but to not feel fear and rage and powerlessness whenever you hear language X spoken, which you currently do. Fear, rage, and powerlessness are not great motivators for language learning. That's why Batman is a detective and martial artist and not a polyglot spy. It's putting the cart before the horse. We need to deal with the negative emotions, and then, if the language speaks to us, independent of that, we can explore it without the baggage. If you've got a story about trying to learn a language for all the wrong reasons, by the way, please let me know in the comments. I think we all have this story. How did you realize it was the case? Was it this video right now? One of the main takeaways I have for language learning is to set yourself up as best as you can for success, but also be gentle with yourself when you fall short. It's a cliche, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. Unless you do the Lingoda sprint, but you know what I meant. So let's put all this high-level stuff together, and then I'll discuss the complications neurospiciness brings to the table. Getting hungry. You probably already know what language you want to study, but if you don't, pick something that makes you excited and makes your heart jump when you think about learning it. Don't punish yourself. Next, you'll want to determine what your goals are. These can change. I like to set an achievable 3-month goal. This can be built into a course, as with some of my sponsors, or it can be a natural landmark, like I'm going to work through all the materials in this textbook and then dump all the vocabulary into Anki so I memorize it all over the next 3 months, or whatever you feel like. If it's a memorization goal, set something reasonable. This means actually do the math on how much time a day you can reasonably dedicate to your spaced repetition, and do that, not a number that sounds great but is unreasonable, like 500 new words a day. That is burnout city. After like a week. Choose your materials based on what your goal is, and then actually schedule time to dedicate to language learning. If you're just totally addicted and you're going to be studying a language or two in your free time no matter what, then this is maybe not strictly necessary. But even for those of us like that, setting specific times for working towards specific goals is a game changer. And for everybody else, it's non-negotiable. Preferably in a dedicated place that gets you in a good mindset, and preferably when you're well rested and energized. But as the father of a toddler, I understand that these are what a friend of mine calls asymptotic aspirations. As you're learning, try to make connections and mix and match what you've already learned. Make as vivid connections as possible, but don't worry if that still isn't enough to be able to immediately recall perfectly tomorrow. If you can, take a nap. But of course, I understand we can't all take a nap, even if we really want one. I'm so tired. If you're one of those spreadsheet people, track your progress. It's motivating to see how much you've already engaged with and learn some of. And don't hesitate to ditch learning materials if they're not working. I used to be a completionist. I bought this book, so I'm reading the whole thing. That's the sunk cost fallacy. If a teacher or an app or a book isn't working for you, ditch it and do something you'll actually engage with. This last part is key. I know someone studying a language who knows they can't commit to 100 or more Anki cards a day, but finds memorizing with Anki to be a decent approach. They're doing 5 new words a day. Will that take forever? Absolutely. Are they slowly chipping away and making incremental progress? Yes. And that slow, incremental progress and daily engagement with their target language is a whole lot better than doing 30 words once a week on Sundays, or aiming for 30 new words a day and failing after 3 days because the pace of reviews is just too imposing and overwhelming for what they can do right now. Of course, if you have the money and the time and the mental bandwidth, of course, it is better to do more rather than less, and more engagement with real content and, gasp, real people rather than less. So yeah, if you can move to France for 6 months and just bicycle from vineyard to vineyard while taking language lessons from a private tutor, then just do that. I have an acquaintance who is a woofer, that's a fancy farm worker, and he just learned apiculture in France. That and how to flirt. He taught me that you can't miss with souhaiterais-tu davantage du vin because it's très classe. Oh là là, oh là là, oh là là. So that's all fine and good, but what if I'm neurospicy? you're in luck. There's actually not a lot of academic literature on this, but there's some tips that will be useful. If you're watching my channel, the most likely forms of neurodivergence are ADHD and autism spectrum. You may know them as zoomy brain and touch of the tism. ADHD seems more likely from comments and channel stats and, the world. So to my understanding, the parts that are relevant to language learning are around novelty and habit formation. ADHD is a disorder of the dopaminergic systems in the brain, at least that's what I'm told. This means that the part of language learning that is going to be fun and no problem is the novelty. New words are a delicious dopamine hit. Of course, once you've got that hit, the tedious slog of actually memorizing that word long term can feel like being flayed and put in a pit of fire ants. The classic ADHD thing is to jump from language to language, looking for a fix for your language Jones. Ask me how I know. I dare you. This is where the immersion guys who talk about extensive reading and listening of engaging real-world content are onto something. Now, what they're describing isn't real immersion, but it's sidestepping the tedium of learning grammatical patterns and memorizing them through spaced repetition and so on for just brute forcing memorization through massive volume. However, this works better for some ADHDers because the things you're learning are embedded in interesting content. So while it's a slower overall strategy for most, it can actually play right into ADHDers' strengths. I also recently learned from Dr. K that the sort of habit centers of the brain are not directly tied to the areas affected by ADHD, meaning habits can save you from failure. The process of developing a routine and habit over about 3 weeks is a nightmare, but once it's done, it's automatic. So if you say, every day I'm going to sit down in my study nook at 4 p.m. and study German, and you have a little Kaffee und Kuchen because it's 4 p.m., even if you only tell yourself you're going to study for 5 minutes and check back in, after those 3 weeks, you got your Kaffee und Kuchen and Deutsch habit going. And the cookie is actually really important, not just because you'll need more sugars for your brain because that's just how ADHD works, but also because the cookie can be a metaphor. It can be any kind of treat that gets the dopamine flowing. Honestly, I know some for whom it's getting a fix from another language. For me, lately it's YouTube bookbinding content, which is how the ADHDers in my life know that I don't actually have ADHD. I find it very meditative. Oh, that and Max Konia's awesome ear training content. While there are stereotypes about what autism spectrum disorder looks like, many of which contribute to difficulty with diagnosis, there are many ASD folks who have low or no support needs. If this is you and you're taking on a new language this year, some key points to add additional focus will be around understanding cultural differences and cultural assumptions. One way these manifest is what anthropologists call schema, or less often schemata. Basically, unspoken assumptions about how a given interaction is supposed to go. So for instance, in the US, when you enter a store, an assumption is that you may be greeted by a sales associate or left alone. In France and Italy, the unspoken assumption is that you greet the shopkeeper or whoever it is. Failure to do so will trigger a script in their mind that you are being intentionally rude. Sound familiar? And then they'll follow that script, which is often slightly hostile and very indirect. The great thing is that a lot of language learning resources like textbooks, teachers, and even many apps will intentionally go out of their way to explicitly teach these things, so that's nice. But you'll also want to make sure you know what the gestures and body language mean as well. A last piece that's good for everybody is just accountability. Now, I won't personally hold you accountable, but it won't hurt to leave a comment here and let me know what your language of interest is, what your goals are, and what your short-term plan to move towards those goals is. And if you did this last year, let me know what you learned. What successes did you have? Let's start this arbitrary administrative unit right. By the way, if you like what I'm doing with the channel, please like, subscribe, and just leave me that comment. You can support the channel with super thanks right here on YouTube or over at patreon.com/languagejones. And if you don't like what I'm doing with the channel, leave me a comment with feedback and share with 3 of your friends so you can all hate watch the channel and bond over that. Personally, I'm going to continue focusing on French and Hebrew this year, slowly building my Spanish, and the occasional side quest in Persian and Aramaic or whatever. I'll be back on live streaming at some point, and any sponsored content you see from me I actually use, but don't take my word for it. Find what works for you. That's why I started this video by telling you not to trust influencers' claims based on their personal experience. I don't identify as an influencer, but they keep calling me that on sponsorship contracts. I've got some spicy new videos coming up in the new year, and if enough people ask for it, I might even make a video about the linguistics of ASMR. And if a lot of people ask for it, I'll make it with ASMR. Who's the influencer now? Until next time, Happy New Year and happy learning.